Thank you, Madam President. Unfortunately, I can't congratulate anybody for this report since it simply disregards reality. 1 in 5 in Europe, 1 in 5 young people are unemployed. Every other young person, 1 in 2 in Greece is unemployed. Meanwhile, we see an influx of refugees, many of whom have no qualifications, streaming into Europe. I heard Mr. Chechin talking about a new economic miracle in Germany, because all these refugees are just the people that Mercedes need. Let's take a sober look at reality, ladies and gentlemen. Just 54 people have been working for German stock market quoted companies, 50 for the post office. This is a ridiculous proportion of the 1 million refugees. Who's left over? People who have to take up cheap jobs that will lead to social tension and an increasingly sense of frustration and bitterness amongst citizens who will blame the EU for all of this.
The next speaker is Mrs. TREBESIUS. You have 1 minute.
Ja, vielen Dank, Frau Vorsitzende.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam President. Well, Angela Merkel said in November 2015 that the German Labour Party was looking for workers, and Germany was a rich country that could receive many people. Well, today we've heard from all of the listed companies on the German stock market that only 55 refugees have actually received employment. Every migrant who's not in employment costs the German state 50,000 euros. And if we're talking about more than a million people this year, we could be talking about 3 billion euros. And I think that we have to be quite cautious here. Of course, there are going to be employers who do give jobs to refugees, but it seems that Merkel's future vision for the German labour market looks like something of a fiasco. If the German labour market doesn't manage it, then how is the Italian, Greek, Portuguese or French labour market going to integrate these people? Mrs. Merkel's rich society has got potholed roads, collapsing schools and bridges. I mean, I don't think there's no money available for all of this.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union needs to think about how to get back on track. But there's another job of work to help integrate people into the labour market, these so-called refugees. There's more than 1 million of them who in the last year found their way to Germany. They were welcomed with great panache by Mr. Zechel, chairman of Daimler, who said most refugees are young, trained and highly motivated. This is exactly the kind of people we're looking for. That was pretty much the only thing he had to say on the topic, because he hasn't actually taken on anybody, and the 30 biggest German companies on the DAX index have taken on 54 refugees in total. So if we compare that, ladies and gentlemen, with the figures going back to the New Year on the Cologne square, there were 138 perpetrators from the same group, these so-called refugees. That's what reality of social inclusion and integration in Germany looks like at the moment. And Mr. Müller from Volkswagen, who ought to be grappling with quite other problems, has expressed interest in the views of the AfD, and I think it really shows how far removed these people are from reality.
Dear colleague, it seems that the EU hasn't learned the lessons of Brexit. It's not ready to do so. Most citizens in the European Union are of the view that this movement of peoples has to be stopped, and the tragic living conditions which result from poverty, war, conflict, these tragic conditions and living conditions have to be dealt with on the spot. We can't export these problems to Europe. Some people think that we are making racist and populist statements, and we're being branded as such. But I'm very interested to see what happens. You can wait. You can sit back and wait until one country after another leaves the European Union. You can wait until the entire construction collapses upon itself, or else you can listen to what people are saying.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. von Storch. You have 2 minutes.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you. We're talking today about refugees, and their so-called social integration or inclusion in the labour market. There's an opinion poll published in the FFA newspaper today. The newspaper spoke to the 30 biggest companies in Germany. They all have turnover at least 1.1 billion euros, and they have 1.5 million employers. All those companies together have, since June, hired 54 refugees. The Post Office 50, S&P 2, and another company 2. In other words, the vast majority of German major companies haven't hired any refugees, including Daimler. Mr. Setcher, who we've just heard about, referred to refugees, describing them as the basis for the next economic miracle. He said that's exactly the type of people we're looking for, Mercedes. However, it now emerges that he hasn't hired a single one, not even a token refugee. The fact is, what's awaiting us is not an economic miracle, but an enormous burden on our social state. We haven't allowed well-trained technicians into the country. In the best possible scenario, we've allowed highly motivated young people in who have no qualifications and won't be able to get qualifications in a highly technical market. They simply couldn't find work in their own country. We have to face up to reality. Reality is that refugees are here on a temporary basis. In other words, they don't need to be integrated even to the labour market. We have to help them as much as we can, but we can't help them all. Moreover, refugees should be coming in via normal immigration channels rather than asylum. So we do need Fortress Europe. At the same time, national law should be allowed to establish rules on migrants based on the specific needs of the labour market, and each country should be able to establish itself how many it takes in.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Bizzotto has the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. In Europe, there are 22 million unemployed citizens and 122 million people who are living in poverty. This is what will drop the mask of the face of the left. We don't need new migrants. Let us stop playing with words. The real refugees only account for 30% of the illegal migrants who arrive in Italy. The word refugee means that the person will go back to their country of origin once the war has come to an end. That is why talking about long-term integration and having a debate on that is useless. We all know that this open door policy for everyone will lead to the death of the peoples of Europe. You should be ashamed because you are aiding and abetting the human smugglers. You're not saving human lives. You're not saving people from poverty. You're just importing millions of new slaves. The migrant business, of course, plays into the hands of multinationals, and this, of course, will push down the wages of our own citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We talk about a social inclusion of immigrations and equal treatment of those who are unequal. When I read this report, it's hard not to see why Brexit is happening and why so many people in Germany are despairing. The Immigration and Refugees Office in Germany's boss, Mr. Frank, assumes that about 10% of refugees are qualified for the labour market. In total, refugees represent a burden on the labour market. Why is that the case? Plato talked about people forming a political commonwealth based on a common origin, common language, common culture and common historical experience together with common citizenship. And language courses won't fit the bill there to make up the gap. You can't have cohesion between uncohesive elements.
Madam President, thank you very much for giving me the floor. The major challenge that the European faces right now is how it is going to manage the refugee crisis. Well, that might seem to be the case at first sight, but the real question is how can we stop this crisis? Many of these migrants have very different cultures, and is it possible for different cultures to live together harmoniously? No, multiculturalism has failed. Now, It's a question of 100% integration. That's the hope, that these refugees are going to integrate in European culture and European society. Well, what do they get in return? They get social protections, they get health care, they get housing, they get a job. But where can European citizens actually get access to this? And what is all this supposed to cost? Nothing. If you don't follow the quotas, then the country has to pay 250,000 euros for in compensation. I mean, that's ridiculous.